practice program is really important to not only me, but also the ICD. And also what I think is great is that it's going to be spearheaded by Ambassador Karl Erik. So when I first started the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, as you all probably know, in 1999, one of the main reasons why I did so is we saw there was a big gap. There was very little research in the field. If you wanted to learn about cultural diplomacy, you almost couldn't. You could count on your hands almost how many books were published. It was also something that was quite difficult to learn. You couldn't actually, there weren't courses offered in cultural diplomacy, there weren't degree programs. Thirdly, the only activities taking place in cultural diplomacy, more or less, were governmental. You had British Council, Goethe Institute, etc. So this practice of cultural diplomacy wasn't so explored. In a sense, it was very often the same methodologies that were being repeated, whether it was academic exchange, jazz musicians being sent back and forth, etc. Which is great, but on the other hand, we really do need to find other practices, other ways in which we can actually bring people together, transcend borders, and help educate, enhance, and sustain relationships between countries and cultures. So that's where I think today is a really important day as we launch this Cultural Diplomacy and Practice program. The program is designed to really come up with tools and practices where cultural diplomacy is now being applied, as well as where it could be applied, so that we won't be limited using the same tools that we used the last 100 years, and we can be quite innovative. And I think the big opportunity that I see for cultural diplomacy is in particular in conflict situations, where there's very little work actually being done in the field of cultural diplomacy. Very often in conflict situations, it's thought of, okay, those people are at war, let it be, and let's focus the cultural diplomacy on other places where there isn't a conflict or war. I recognize the fact that it's very difficult, especially if there's a conflict taking place. But therefore, it's also all the more necessary that we actually do try to offer some sort of solutions to provide alternatives to conflict. So I think that's, for me, where I see really the biggest challenge for us, is we try to address new practices of cultural diplomacy, new tools. Of course, we should do it in countries that have peaceful relationships. But I think the real test is, what do we do if there's two countries that don't want to work together, two countries that are maybe in conflict? Can something be done there? And I think that's really where we need to be very creative and very innovative when we look at this. So that's, I guess, just a few words as to why I'm really excited that we're launching the Cultural Diplomacy and Practice program. The second thing I wanted to do is to tell you why I'm excited that Ambassador Karl Erik is going to be spearheading this with us. For those of you who don't know Ambassador Norman, he's a man really of much experience, primarily in the field of diplomacy, but not only. He was a long time a diplomat for the Swedish Foreign Ministry, serving as ambassador for Sweden on a number of occasions. He also served as head of the cultural department of the Swedish Foreign Ministry, where he was actually designing and implementing practice of cultural diplomacy. So that's he's been there, he's done that as ambassador from the Foreign Ministry. Quite interesting now, he's actually shifted more to civil society. So in the second part of his life, we can say, really his heart for culture has caught up with him. I think it's something that's been in your heart your whole life, especially his wife is a fairly well-known opera singer. So I think in many ways you're a man of culture, and he's really practicing it. Initially with an organization he started himself, called the European Cultural Parliament, which is the only organization of its kind really bringing together Europeans on the cultural front. As we know, the European Union is covering it when it comes to the politics and the economics, but the big niche that also Karl Erik and the ECP is trying to fulfill is the cultural sort of niche. So in that sense, he's bringing to ICD a lot with him already through his work with the ECP, through his career as a diplomat. He's been a member of the academic board and the advisory board of ICD for quite some time. He's also served as professor, teaching during the MA students for the MA program. And now is going to be spearheading our Cultural Diplomacy and Practice department. So I'm really excited. I think really we can learn a lot from you, Karl Erik. We can benefit from your experience, and I think really you'll serve as a great springboard as we throw different ideas there in terms of what tools can we consider when it comes to arts, music, sports, etc., when trying to tackle some of the global challenges where ICD, I think, can make a difference. So I'd ask you to please join me in expressing a warm welcome to Ambassador Karl Erik Norman and his introductory speech on Cultural Diplomacy and Practice. Ambassador Karl Erik Norman. Thank you.
Thank you. Please call me Karl Erik. I'm the guy in the middle there. We have decided to do it the following way. First, a few more or less philosophical remarks about cultural diplomacy, perhaps heading against the practical aspects of it. Then Charlotte will make a presentation on practical cultural diplomacy, and then I will come back and give you a few examples That's how we are going to deal with it. And you are welcome to interrupt me whenever you wish. First of all, I myself, and I think almost everybody of you asked yourself when you joined this institution, what is cultural diplomacy? Or is anybody prepared to say it right now in one sentence, then we can stop the, this first part of it? I see now. Now, so let's say culture, of course. It goes without saying that culture, at least, well, it has many facets. It can be the whole universe. It could be anything that is sort of growing and developing on this earth. But it usually, we define it in either one way or another. We define it as the arts, and then myself having one step, as Mark said, in the or 1 foot in the arts world, there is, I think, that part of life should be looked upon with a lot of respect, because arts, when it's good, it's magic. If it's not magic, it's not good arts, at least. It might be then, let's say, amateur arts, so it may make fun, but it's not arts as I see it. And anybody who is an artist, a full-time artist, a singer, an author, a visual artist, whatever, is usually has some kind of mission. He or she felt at a rather early stage in life, I have to be an author, or I have to make music. And anything else is, for me, relatively irrelevant. And that is another outset which is important to have in mind when dealing with artists and respecting artists, that they are, and particularly when we are coming a little bit later on to cultural diplomacy and using the artists, which some artists would call instrumentalizing the artists. Then we are into a rather tricky gray zone between normal diplomacy and the arts. So this is one way to define the arts or to define culture. It's when we come to practical aspects of cultural diplomacy, I guess we will have to look rather much at the arts and the role of arts in that context. But I think for the ICD, generally speaking, and ICD's place in the universe, then I think we are perhaps rather speaking about culture, meaning civilization, way of life, and different ways of life that we have to meet or cannot somehow live well with each other and may need a little bit help to be able to accommodate each other in a peaceful way. And I guess for an institution like ICD, that particular meaning of culture is maybe a little bit more important. Now, diplomacy. I joined Swedish diplomacy before most of you were born. It was, well, a diplomat is somebody working for a foreign ministry, normally speaking. Diplomacy is something which has to do, as you said, mainly with dealing with governments. It's a communication between governments. But there will always be people questioning, why do we need diplomats in the first place? There was a Swedish author, a drama writer in the late 60s already. He wrote a play where one of the protagonists said, all of a sudden, why do we need diplomats now that we have telephone? Well, good question. You could call each other instead of having an expensive embassy sitting there and costing the taxpayers a lot of money and so on. The question has become even more relevant, of course, when we got fax, and even more when we got the internet and the email and the Facebook and the Twitter and so on and so forth. There are so many means of communication. Why do we need diplomats? Isn't that something rather anachronistic? Well, at one stage, at least when I was a young diplomat, there was still one excuse which was relevant for diplomacy, and that was the carriers of secrets. It was the confidential aspect of diplomacy. You had to learn as a young diplomat to do crypto. It was each country had a particular system of crypto, how to hide what you're saying. A sentence came out like but then you put it in a machine and then it came out, the Soviet Union is of the opinion that, and so on and so on. So this was how you worked with secrets at the time. Confidentiality was more or less the raison d'etre of diplomats, embassies, and diplomacy. But then last year we had WikiLeaks. Now, so what is secret? Are there still any room for any secrets at this stage? All of a sudden, very secret depeches or reports from the American embassy in Tehran or from various places around the world became common knowledge. How do you deal with diplomacy when you can't keep any secrets anymore, when there are no instruments? Because you can always bet that the hackers or Mr. Assange or who else will be one step ahead and will reveal your new technique of hiding your confidential aspects. I was speaking to my son, who is 35 and who is in the IT business anyway, and said, now, I guess I now got the final argument to get rid of diplomacy of the traditional way. No, he said, wasn't it? There's still one way, of course. And that is the old-fashioned way, just writing a letter. Not on such a thing, because then there may rest a copy that you can somehow see, but just writing a letter, put it in your pocket, see to it that nobody takes your jacket off, and you deliver that letter. Or you just deliver it, perhaps you can't even deliver it orally, because there may be microphones around and so on. So perhaps you have to go back to the very, very original part of diplomacy, which was, you know, in the 15th, 16th century, 17th century, when they used to call the ministries for foreign affairs, they used to call them, at least in my part of the world, the Ministry for Foreign Correspondence. Now, so this was, we may be the whole circle around, that is as far as the role of diplomacy, the traditional diplomacy is concerned. Then, of course, you have other aspects. You have the Vienna Convention, you may have heard about. How many people have heard about the Vienna Convention? Some of you. So, what is it? Yes? Yes?
I've heard of it, but I can't remember.
Okay, somebody who knows what it is.
It states the rules of diplomacy, the roles of diplomats.
Exactly, and it was signed where and when? Well, where you can guess, but when? It was 1815. It was, let's say, after the Napoleon Wars. The European heads of states and foreign ministers met in Vienna, and to more or less to write the new maps for Europe. And at the same time, they wrote the guidebook, the instruction book for diplomacy, how to behave, what diplomats may do, what they may not do, and also about this famous diplomatic immunity and so on, this kind of stuff. So the Vienna Convention put the legal framework for diplomacy, and also, of course, was part of, Vienna was a perfect place for that, of course, for the ceremonial of diplomacy, the protocol, etc., etc. Now, so much about diplomacy, so much about culture, so much about and diplomacy. So cultural diplomacy then. When I met Mark for the first time, I realized that I had been a cultural diplomat for quite some time. I knew that I had at some stage in my career been a cultural attaché. And some people had even called me a cultural ambassador at some stage because I was so interested in culture and wanted to promote that. But then cultural diplomacy, here's still some work to do for ICD to tell all these cultural attaches and counselors all around the world that they are cultural diplomats. They are doing a job which, according to our definitions here, could be characterized as at least one part, maybe not the biggest part, but one part of cultural diplomacy. And it's definitely, to come a little bit closer to today's theme, it's definitely cultural diplomacy in practice, practical cultural diplomacy. The hands are a little bit bound by most cultural attaches, because a normal cultural attaché here in Berlin, let's say the average, we are not speaking about the big embassies, they would have something like 10 or 15,000 euro per year to present a program about their country, which is really peanuts. If you think of what it costs to bring, I heard young cultural attachés saying, then, well, when I come to New York or to Tokyo, I want to bring a symphony orchestra there. So, okay, thank you, good luck. A symphony orchestra, you start, well, let's say a smaller one, let's say a Mozart type one, 70 people. Well, multiply 70 people with the air ticket to Tokyo plus the hotel ticket and the per diems and so on, and you have a nice little budget. The hard reality for a cultural diplomat at the cultural institutes or at the embassies around the world is that they have to fight daily with their budget. The other thing, which I believe in for ICD very much, is to have a role in the intercultural dialogue. And I think this is something that we should, in the third part of our presentation today, we should discuss a little bit more. Of course, it goes without saying that cultural diplomacy is hardly any cultural diplomacy if it is not cultural diplomacy in practice. I hear nobody objecting, but because I know there is one objection to that, namely. And the objection would be, of course, and I'm coming to that a little bit later, the cultural diplomacy, like as a forum for intercultural dialogue, we do not have very much in the world. Every now and then, for instance, the European Union celebrated the Year of Intercultural Dialogue in 2008, and there are initiatives of that kind. And many politicians are anxious every now and then to speak about intercultural dialogue, but to my knowledge, there's not very much on forums for intercultural dialogue. I think here is one place where intercultural dialogue could be discussed both in practice and in theory. And this should, of course, not be limited to Berlin, but should definitely be something which should spread worldwide one way or another. There are some very interesting strategies to look at and to discuss in that particular context. But just to end this first part, you hinted, Mark, that it may be difficult in some cases to practice cultural diplomacy. How do I practice cultural diplomacy with the Talibans? Well, what would they like from me in order for them to understand me better? Or how do we, let's say we have some hostage case, or we have some other case which is very tricky and sensitive. How can you solve that with cultural diplomacy? This is one of the challenges, of course, if we are speaking about rather extreme groups. We could mention also North Korea, but already that is easier. I know that Mark loves the example of the symphony orchestra going to Kim Jong-il. Was it the New Yorkers, I think, going to Kim Jong-il in the 90s or something like that. Because somehow they have an ambition to show up as a an interesting cultural country with a lot of interesting artists. So in that way, there is a platform to meet somehow. The same would, of course, go for China, because China share very many of our other ambitions. So also, if we don't like, let's say, Chinese politics, cultural diplomacy is very much an instrument which is possible to use. As I hinted, I lived through a long time of Cold War. Of course, Sweden was neutral and kind of neutral and in the middle, but the rules for the Cold War between the two superpowers, Soviet Union and United States, were of course such that you could expose a lot of cultural diplomacy during that time. You called it peaceful coexistence through culture. That was the term at the time. And of course, since peaceful coexistence is one of the goals of ICD, then it is, let's say, cultural diplomacy is a follower. Finally, before I ask Charlotte to go into the subject a little bit more closely, I said there cannot be any cultural diplomacy without practice, but I think there is another niche which would be particularly important for this institute, and that is, of course, research. Very little research, to my knowledge, has been done. This institute, of course, a vision would be that this institute would be the place where scientists come on a residence basis, where a new doctor on one or another aspect of cultural diplomacy is graduated every year, and so on. This kind of vision and possibility, role for the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, I think, could be crucial. Now, Charlotte will take over on the practical cultural diplomacy.